thank you all for coming. We are in a very important battle here in Washington. First, to try to get climate change right, and second of all, to make sure that the democracy that surrounds this issue is healthy and correct. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have problems in both areas. So I'm very grateful that we have this panel here. One of the tricks and strategies of the deniers is to try to limit the discussion to the areas in which they can successfully raise doubt. They don't want to talk about the national security implications of climate change, for instance. But when those concerns were raised recently by Secretary Kerry and then challenged by some of our colleagues, Chairman Waxman and I wrote, I think, a very effective letter back pointing out how many different national security officials under both Republican and Democratic administrations had identified climate change as a very, very significant national security concern of the United States. And it's not hard to understand why when you think of what rising sea levels do to low-level populations. Dealing with this is very challenging for the deniers. We had a hearing in EPW recently where the best the Republican denier witness could do with this was to say that he used the example of Bangladesh, and he said if Bangladesh were flooded, well, that would just mean that the people would have to relocate, but then there'd be lots of marsh, and marsh is good for the environment. So if you are a deeply ignorant person, you might let that pass. But if you have any understanding of the regional politics and of the type of humanitarian concerns that that kind of a relocation would produce, and the danger of upheaval and competition for scarce resources and so forth, I don't think logical, rational, knowledgeable people could look at that scenario with the kind of equanimity that the deniers do. So we want to focus on this issue. I have been a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee for several years. I'm not on it now, but I was, and we asked for and received and have since followed the national intelligence estimates on climate change. And of course, on the defense side, we have the quadrennial reviews. The most recent one was just this week, and it spoke very strongly to the national security concerns around climate change. So I'm delighted to have this hearing. I want to thank General Galloway and General Cheney and Captain Gensler for being here to help illuminate this issue, and I'll turn now to my vaunted, admired, respected colleague,
Henry Waxman.
I'll call him Chairman Waxman,
Henry
because you're the
Waxman.
chairman of this.
I mean, vaunted, admired. Don't forget my name.
No, I got your name. Trust me, Henry, I got your name. I just was stuck between whether to call you representative or chairman.
all
I
the
think here
great
I can call
things.
you chairman.
Okay. The Senator Whitehouse and I have organized this Bicameral Task Force on climate change, and we're trying to bring the issue home to people to understand this is a serious matter that must be addressed. It can't be swept under the rug, so to speak, ignored, giving in to the deniers who want to wish it away. And having the witnesses here today is very important for us. We're pleased to have Brigadier General Cheney, Brigadier General Galloway, Captain Gensler. We appreciate your service to our country, and we look forward to hearing your presentations in a few moments. But this forum today is to examine the connection between national security and climate change. People don't usually think of those two things going together. Experts are increasingly drawing the link when they look at Syria and what's going on in Syria, because some analysts believe that climate change has played an important role in the nation's upheaval as they face drought and what that does to the country. Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines has required a serious commitment to humanitarian missions. Of course, we've had humanitarian missions in this country with Hurricane Sandy and the droughts and other climate impacts. Well, our armed services are working to understand and predict these new threats so they can prepare for and manage them. The 2014 Quadrennial Review, Defense Review, was released earlier this week, and it warns us that climate change poses a significant threat to the United States and the world at large. Climate change affects food security, dangerous weather events, water access, and human migration, all of which can increase conflict and instability in the most volatile regions of the world. Admiral Samuel Locklear, the third chief of U.S. military forces in the Pacific region, said that the biggest long-term security threat in the region is climate change because, quote, it is probably the most likely thing that is going to happen that will cripple the security environment, end quote. And the 2014 review QDR states that climate change acts as a threat multiplier for conditions that can enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence. So this is a serious matter, and it calls for serious attention and action to address it. There may be members who want to deny it all. There are some, but I think there's a growing consensus among the U.S. military that climate change is a real threat to our national security. And if our troops are defending us from the threat of climate change abroad, we should be doing our part to fight the threat of climate change at home by enacting policies that reduce emissions and build resilience in our community. I want to introduce the witnesses so that we know fully why they're here and their qualifications for speaking to us. Brigadier General Stephen Cheney is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Security Project. He has over 30 years' experience as a Marine and served as Deputy Executive Secretary to Defense Secretaries Cheney, no relationship, I assume, and Aspen.
No.
Brigadier General Gerald Galloway is a professor of engineering at the University of Maryland. He had a 38-year career in the U.S. Army and served 8 additional years in the federal government, most of which was associated with water resources management. And former Captain John Gensler is a Truman National Security Project Fellow. He served as an active duty officer in the U.S. Army, deploying to the Middle East twice as a combat platoon leader. And since departing the Army, his work focused on business development efforts for clean energy technology companies. So we're pleased to have the three of you here. And Brigadier General Cheney, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Congressman Waxman. And Senator, I appreciate you both and your support for this issue, which we feel is important. You pointed out that I'm a Marine, and one of my favorite Marines was Sergeant Stryker. Now, you probably don't know who that is, but he was in the Sands of Iwo Jima, played by John Wayne, and one of his favorite quotes is, "Life is tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid." And, well, life will be a lot tougher if you don't believe in climate change. So we truly believe at the American Security Project that climate change is a threat to our national security, and indeed it's a threat to the security of hundreds of millions around the world. For those not familiar with the American Security Project, founded in 2005 by some names familiar to you, Senators Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman, and one of our plank issues was climate change and national security, so we added on 7 flag officers, almost all 3- and 4-star generals and admirals from all 4 services, who all figured that climate change was a threat to our security. Let me start off with the facts that, as we see them on climate change, caused largely, as we all know, by the burning of fossil fuels. It's real. It's already affecting America's national security. The temperature record is undisputable. Over the past century, the average mean global temperature has gone up 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. While it's true the Earth's climate has always undergone periods of fluctuations, this period is particularly notable because it's especially rapid and unprecedented. The effects of climate change are clearly accelerating. Just look at the Arctic, increasingly ice-free in the summers. Look at the extreme weather conditions, unpredictable as you know. New York Harbor water has gone up a foot in the last century. Climate change threatens our national security because, as we say in the military, it is a threat multiplier or an accelerant of instability. And it affects issues like food and water availability and in energy security. It's going to drive migration. It's going to create economic challenges. Let me talk for a second about our own homeland security. It's not just a threat around the world. It affects us here clearly. You mentioned Superstorm Sandy. These events were no less traumatic than any other homeland security missions that we have. I was the former commanding general at Parris Island when I took over in 1999. My predecessor turned to me and he said, "Your biggest problem is going to be hurricanes." 60 days later, Hurricane Floyd, a Category 5 hurricane, took dead aim in our place, and we had to evacuate 10,000 recruits and drill instructors. 2006, I went down and took over the Marine Military Academy in the Rio Grande Valley. When I flew in 2006, the Rio Grande Valley was a verdant green area, soybean, rice, cotton, corn. It really was beautiful. When I left in 2011, none of those crops existed. No cattle industry, the worst drought they've had in their history. Let me shift a little bit to our military bases and stations. They're all the ones on the coast are threatened. Perhaps most prominently would be Naval Air Station Norfolk. A foot or two in sea rise, it's going to go underwater. Pensacola, my own Parris Island, are all very much so threatened. I'll shift to look around the world, and there's certainly hot spots where there's a direct connection between climate change and security. And Senator, I know you mentioned Bangladesh. I belong to the Global Military Advisory Group on Climate Change, of which we've got members from Bangladesh. A 1.5 foot increase in the sea level rise is going to cause 5.5 million refugees out of Bangladesh. And they know that, they understand it, they're not sure what they can do about it. And when you just look a little north to their border, the Indians are not going to welcome any of them. They've got a well-armed border, they don't want any refugees in India. And of course, India's got its own problems. When you look at India and Pakistan, both heavily populated, both nuclear armed, they're at risk from droughts themselves, from extreme weather. It's going to cause migration, and it's going to cause ethnic and cultural groups be forced into competition. Everybody's familiar with what's going on in the Middle East these days. You're going to be traveling out that way tonight. And you mentioned Syria. There, no doubt the drought has caused populations to go into cities and towns like Aleppo, where they have to go and compete for food. High food prices are part of what has driven the Arab Spring. In none of these will climate change necessarily directly cause the conflict, but it will certainly make the already existing threats much, much more dangerous. So we should start by acknowledging climate change risks are real. They're growing every day. We cannot afford to ignore them. And here's one of my favorite lines. Even if you choose not to believe that human activity contributes to climate change, or even that climate change is changing, from our military experience, we know that waiting for certainty on the battlefield will be disastrous. We've got to do something now about it. Managing risk requires a measured response, the first step of which is an energy debate that addresses the challenges of the 21st century. The greatest danger lies in our being unprepared, and all of this argues for prudent, no-regrets action to reduce emissions and build greater resiliency now in order to reduce future risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Brigadier General Galloway.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, Congressman Waxman. I appreciate the opportunity. I doubly appreciate what you all are doing to put this in front of the nation and to address this issue. There is an impact of climate change on military operations and national security, and I think it needs to be recognized. My colleague has very well described many of the challenges we face, and they're both here and abroad. When we operate abroad, we face having to deal with a future that is very uncertain in our country. We are dealing with unknowns, and that's always difficult. From my perspective as a 38-year Army man, and now as an academic and as a consultant in Asia and in Europe, I find that everyone asks the question, what don't people understand? It is happening. The evidence abounds in the many studies that have been conducted, whether it's our own national assessment, which will be issued in final shortly, and the work of the national academies. The Congress asked them to look at it, and they came up with the conclusions that it is happening and it is human caused in part. And how much is another issue, but it abounds, and it's very clear that the planet is warming, as General Cheney said. The challenge is, I'm a water person, as was noted, very heavy precipitation is causing us problems in many places in the world, not just the United States, but abroad. When you look at what happened in Australia and what's happened in Thailand and many other places, it continues to rise. Climate change is bringing more intense rainfall events, and we expect that to continue. Sea level is rising. Norfolk has been one of many places, and of course the Army is allied with that at Fort Eustis and the Air Force at Langley. So we're working together to deal with this issue, but we're just now recognizing that. I'd like to discuss two areas. First, the impact of climate change on our fixed military installations, and second, how it will affect our overseas activities and the things that we do abroad. The potential impact of climate change on our fixed installations is real, and the impact will require increased attention to preparation for climate-related events, and those are the floods and the major storms, the droughts, and the temperature increases. You can say from the start, well, what's temperature got to do with it, except that our soldiers have to train, and training under intense heat, training in facilities that are not properly prepared for that, with equipment that may not be resilient enough to the temperature rises that we expect, will cause significant problems. It's going to get hotter, wetter, and drier. We saw what Sandy and Katrina did to the ability of the nation to move in and around those areas. Imagine if that were a time of great national crises. We needed to deploy forces at that particular time. When communities and installations are unaware of their vulnerability to these events, and that's one of the challenges, the results can be disastrous. A failure to be prepared shifts the military's focus from being ready to deploy at a moment's notice to recovering from the disaster that's just hit them. And it's not just them. It is the communities that surround them. As you know, we act as a partnership. Our soldiers live off the base. The people that are off base come in and work for us. We share many of the resources, and so we have to go at this together. The entire issue of climate change is not just a military national security, it's a community military as a team, and we can add to that our public-private partnerships and our businesses that are working with us. The threat to military installations and the forces is not limited to the buildings. If the local communities are underwater, the support systems that we rely on will not be available, needed supplies may not make it to the base, and transportation routes disappear. During the big flood of the Mississippi in 1993, we shut down transcontinental railroad movement. We shut down bridges across the Mississippi. Again, we don't want to see those things. We want to be better prepared for them, because that can be the lifeline that is cut at a time when we need it to be open. The 2011 floods in Thailand pointed out the supply chain dilemma, where factories in Thailand that we'd never heard of interrupted the supply of parts to the United States and shut down factories and operations here that in turn could disrupt the supply line that is coming to our military. We need to know what are the possible challenges off and on the installations, and we need to be doing something at our installations and with our communities and industrial partners to become more resilient. And resilient is the word. We can be better prepared for it if we start looking now. Overseas, the impacts of climate change will certainly be more severe. And you've already mentioned the typhoons in the Pacific and the problems in Bangladesh. That's certainly a case. They create these potential problems of migration and certainly the instability that results when they cannot respond quickly. Quite obviously, contingency planning must take this into account. The potential for such disasters to interfere with military operations is significant. It's interesting to go back in history to World War II, when the services got together and formed a Rhine River surveillance service that watched how the Rhine was operating, in fear that as the time to cross the Rhine into Germany occurred, the Rhine may make it impossible. And so they put a lot of resources into knowing and understanding what the weather events would be and how things might shift. We did the same thing in Bosnia with the Sava River. We've got to do the same thing with climate. We've always got to take that into account and assume some uncertainty, as General Cheney has noted. The U.S. is known for its rapid response to disasters. I think we can be proud of what the Marines and the Navy have done in the Philippines. It certainly makes a big difference to those people when we can show up quickly. Climate change will require not only the honing of our capacities to provide disaster relief, but of more importance, to help our partners to develop their capacity to deal with that. And we do have some things that are going on. You may not be aware, but the Army Corps of Engineers is helping water resource planning in Southeast Asia and another number of countries. And that building that capacity enables those countries to be more resilient and puts the United States in a good light. They see the face of the United States dealing with an issue and dealing with it in a way that affects not only today, but helps them move better into the future. I think that we face the challenge and we know what it is. It's too easy, however, to put off dealing with the impacts of climate change and place the blame at the foot of uncertainty or the feet of uncertainty. Unfortunately, the actions that need to be taken, adaptation to what's happening, deliberate planning, and resource support for infrastructure modification are actions that require years to design and complete. Even if we start now, at many locations, we'll be behind. Waiting until runways and training areas are underwater is not the time to be moving. I certainly recognize the resource constraints that you all face here on the Congress. On the other hand, postponing it makes it more difficult, it's going to cost more, and it may cause problems that we're not yet aware of. So I would thank you again for what you're doing to bring this to the attention of the country and to say, as General Cheney has said, that climate change is a threat multiplier both here and abroad.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir? Captain
Senator,
Captain
former
Captain Gensler.
former captain, I will assert. I resigned my commission a few years ago, so I'll leave it at former captain. I want to bring the discussion that we've been having to a slightly different and perhaps more personal level, and talk first about why I am here today. And it really begins a couple years after I left the Army in December of 2007. Not very far from here, other side of the mall, across the memorials in Arlington National Cemetery. When I laid to rest Captain Ben Tiffner, who was a fellow West Virginian, a West Point classmate of mine, and a Special Forces officer who was killed in a roadside bomb in Iraq in November of 2007. 3 months later, I stood at attention in the West Point Cemetery, laying to rest another friend, Captain Ben Torrey, who I played sprint football with at the academy, who had been killed in an eerily similar incident just weeks before. These roadside bombs were of the type that were designed, financed, and deployed using oil money. I know the topic today is climate change and national security, but I don't want to lose sight that the root of climate change is also fossil fuels, is also our insatiable need and quest for oil and the finances that are associated with it. Our single source dependence on oil has been a huge risk on the battlefield and to our economic and national security, but it's also one of the primary drivers of the climate risks that we face as well. And as has been noted by my esteemed co-panelists, climate change has drastically increased our need for humanitarian assistance and disaster response in the U.S. military. In October of 2012, in Hurricane Sandy, 14,000 Department of Defense military members and civilians were mobilized to respond to the effects of Sandy. 14,000. I lived through Sandy. I live in Brooklyn. A disaster of massive proportions if you weren't in the area. Not to make light of it, I couldn't leave Brooklyn for several days, maybe a week, which is it's insane to think about. And what I consider to be one of the greatest cities on earth, I couldn't get off a little piece of an island that I was stuck on for a week because of a hurricane. A year later, in 2013, Typhoon Haiyan wreaked destruction in the Philippines, which again, 13,000 military personnel from the U.S. were mobilized to respond to Haiyan on the other side of the earth. 13,000 U.S. military personnel mobilized for that, less than a year later. And the military gets a request like this for humanitarian assistance once every 2 weeks. Once every 2 weeks, we have to respond to something like this. And with the pressures that climate change is putting on the world, you can only expect that pace and the cost associated with that to pick up. But as we've noted, it's not just humanitarian assistance that's going to grow as the effects of climate change manifest around the globe. We are already seeing the destabilizing effects of precarious regions as governments fail to deliver the services that their people rightly expect of them. Living in fragile ecosystems. When water dries up in the Rio Grande Valley, it causes one type of disarray and dislocation. When water dries up in Central Africa, the effects are a lot different. People go to war over water in Central and Eastern Africa. When 20% of Pakistan's land is underwater, like it was in 2010, that causes a massive disruption, massively destabilizing a government that is nuclear armed. What would happen, that happens on a more regular basis, happened in 2011 again in southern Pakistan. This is a regularly occurring phenomenon. Massive floods in a very mountainous region. What happens when parts of that government begin to fall and one of those nuclear weapons ends up in the hands of an Al-Qaeda-like affiliate? I don't know if we're prepared to deal with that right now. The military is certainly thinking about it, but are we really prepared to deal with that happening? These things are happening right now. But it doesn't have to be this way, as we've noted. The Department of Defense has, for several years now, recognized the danger of climate change and our reliance on fossil fuels. And has been taking steps to mitigate the risks. Clean energy technologies across the board are making our military today more capable and secure. This ranges from providing renewable power on the battlefields of Afghanistan to our bases here at home, where the Department of Defense has made massive strides in bringing private capital onto bases, investing in renewable energy technologies, mitigating some of the exposure risks that they have to our volatile energy grid. When I was in Iraq, it was obvious to me that protecting fuel convoys was a really significant risk. Responding to the insurgents' attacks upon them was a fairly dangerous diversion from the mission that we had over there. Today, climate change is imposing a similar burden on our men and women in uniform. As we've noted, it continues to make vulnerable countries less stable. It's providing recruiting opportunities for extremist organizations, and it's contributing to more frequent and severe weather events. And one of my best friends today is deployed somewhere in Central Africa. Special Forces officer. Don't know exactly where he is, but I know that what he's trying to deal with on the ground is being impacted by the shifts in weather that have happened due to climate change. And it's making his job much more difficult and much more likely that I'm going to have to bury him in one of those cemeteries that I spent a couple of trips to 6 years ago. I think that our Congress and our nation needs to follow the way of the military. We're not doing enough, as you've noted, but I think that with more conversation, more open dialogue about what we need to do, and recognizing that these threats are real, that they're present today, we might be able to chart a path forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Shall I start off?
Please.
Well, I want to thank the three of you. That's a very powerful presentation to us. The military, looking at our national security, has to think of all the possibilities that might come up and to be prepared for whatever may occur. There's a management of a risk, and the risks are often unknown but can be predicted. So you in the military and others have given a lot of thought to this issue, and it has put a burden on the military already. You're seeing the results, you're dealing with the results on a humanitarian basis, dealing with your facilities, dealing with our countries around the world that are fragile and are being impacted, the refugees that are resulting. So I've often asked my colleagues who say they don't believe in the theories of the science, that what if they're wrong? If there's a 10% chance that all the horrible things that people are predicting will happen, how can you take the risk of all those things happening by being unprepared and doing nothing about it? That to me is astounding, and it's not a theoretical risk when we're seeing real events taking place that indicate climate change is happening. So it's interesting your point about fossil fuels, because I think that a lot of our military wars have been based on our concern about and fears of losing access to fossil fuels because we've been so dependent on them. And the irony is that the fossil fuels are adding to the carbon emissions and causing the climate change problem. But members of Congress should be anticipating problems and preventing them and getting ready to deal with them, whatever they may be. But too often the only risk our colleagues are looking at is the risk of losing the next election. And they don't want to disappoint the fossil fuel industries that contribute to them. And they don't want to do something that looks like they're dealing with a problem that their party ideology insists is not real because of the fossil fuel impact of the money that goes into these campaigns. So it really is astounding to me on so many different levels to see the basic things that we all learn. Be prepared, anticipate what may happen, be prepared for what you don't fully understand may happen, but make the best judgments you can. Don't ignore problems. And yet we have a willful ignorance in the House of Representatives particularly about the issue, a willful ignorance from the science, and an unwillingness to manage the risks and the uncertainties that become less and less uncertain as we see events moving forward. So I don't really have a question. All the questions I had in mind, you so well explained them, and I think this is an important point. We had a hearing with firefighters who talked about the greater intensity of the fires that they're dealing with. We've had a hearing with people in the agricultural area, and farmers may say, well, I don't know about this climate change, but they certainly notice what's going on. People are catching on to the realities, and their representatives, at least in power in the House, are denying them or ignoring them or avoiding them, which I think is so monumentally and historically disreputable. So thank you for your contribution. Senator?
Thank you, Chairman.
I yield to you.
Each of our witnesses has done our country the great service and had the honor of representing the United States of America overseas in uniform. And I would like to get your comments on how you would anticipate a continuing failure by the United States Congress to address climate change would work out in the outer world, in foreign countries, in places where men and women in uniform are on the ground trying to represent our country well, trying to project the power of this country in positive ways. I come from a different tradition, from the diplomacy side, and I'm very keenly concerned about damage to the soft power, the reputational power, the power of example that America projects around the world, and what happens to that if on something as visible, as impactful in daily lives, particularly to indigenous and poorer people, is so badly gotten wrong by the United States government. If you want to comment on the sort of soft power piece of this, do we really stand up as well as an example of democracy if we blow something as big as this? And if we blow it that badly, how does that affect us around the world in terms of the reputational advantage, I'd say, that we have over other ways of governance?
Senator, clearly, we're not doing as well as we would think, and we're not the leaders in the world on it, although we should be. We did a study about 6 months ago where we went to every country in the world and asked them if they had written climate change into their national security strategy. And 70% of the countries in the world had actually put it into their national security strategy, which we found somewhat surprising. And the 30% that didn't were mostly either third world countries or countries that didn't have much of a defense establishment to start with. And then as my organization works with the European Union and the Global Military Advisory Group on climate change, they keep looking to us to say, why aren't you doing more? And the European Union in particular has leaned on us and said, hey, you understand it. I mean, they got the message that we presented today, but we're just not leaning enough far forward on it. And it's a frustration on their part that here we are, the greatest nation in the world, but we're not on the forefront of the leadership on climate change. Although there are points of brightness here. The QDR is one of them. What some of the efforts going on in the Department of Defense are pretty neat. Secretary Mavis with the alternative fuels. You know, the #1 fossil fuel consuming organization in the country, and some say the world, is the Department of Defense. #1. You know, getting them off of their thirst for those oil products is huge. So we've got a long ways to go, just a long ways to go. We're not doing enough.
The last century has been described as the American century because of America's leadership. World War I, World War II, Cold War. And I think it's pretty much indisputable that our leadership has been a force for good in the world, indeed a force for a very great deal of good in the world. And I had a conversation with Secretary Kissinger the other day. He's a very astute and experienced observer of world events, and he made the point with a phrase that I have remembered ever since he said it. He made the point that all of the great upheavals and all of the great revolutions in the world have resulted from a confluence of resentments. A confluence of resentments. And if you look forward to what might end the American century or prevent this century from being an American century, and if you accept that there's a confluence of resentments that would be the thing that does that always has through history, and you look for where you might find a confluence of resentments that could inhibit America's force for good in the world, I think having folks in all sorts of different locations around the world find that the fishery that they depended on isn't there any longer, that the beach they used to launch their boats from isn't there any longer, that the marshes where they used to grow their crops have been inundated and are now salt marshes and not hospitable to their crops, that the glacier-fed rivers that they used to depend on for irrigation are no longer coming in on time with their crops, that there is competition for resources that is putting villages that used to be friends and live in harmony with one another at odds with one another. And all of that gets ascribed back to the problems of climate change, and that in turn gets ascribed back to a failure of leadership by this country. That's not an optimal situation, and I think that's actually a dangerous situation for us. So I think our very failure in Congress to deal with this has national security implications, entirely apart from the implications of the actual changes in climate and habitat and animal range and river flow and all those other changes.
I would agree with you, Senator. I know Southeast Asia because I've been working on some projects there, and where the country team, the State Department and the military, Admiral Locklear's ideas of saying this is important and I want my forces to know about it, enables the military in these countries to recognize that they need to be worrying about that at the same time their civilian counterparts worry about it. We have a very good relationship, has been illustrated here by how we respond to disasters in this country, but it's not the same everywhere. And the more we can do to influence the relationships between the in-country civilian organizations and the military will certainly benefit us in this disaster relief and also in increasing the resilience, reducing the damages. But that's going to take them believing that we're serious about this. And I think sometimes when I go to Asia, they say, well, I just read the Congress said this. And unfortunately, the Congress takes the hit.
Sometimes we've earned it by what we said. Well,
I have one comment in
Please.
reaction to what you just said, Senator, and referencing the last century as the American century. Another way to look at the last 100 or so years would be to recognize it as the oil century. America's rise was fueled by oil and coal, and that's a fact. What is also a fact that we're not recognizing is that the world has changed. Our understanding of the world has changed and shifted, and we seem to be tied to an inextricable link, thinking that the next American century also has to be an oil century, and that's the only way it can be such. And we have to segregate those views and understand that it can't be an American century if it's an oil century. It will necessarily cause our demise by destabilizing the world to a point where it can't accept democracy as we have built it here in America. And that may be one of the greatest long-term risks. If we're unable to separate those viewpoints, the world will become too destabilized for democracy. And that is what really scares me.
I'd agree with you and add an additional point in support of what you're saying, and that is that if it's not going to be an oil century, it's going to be a clean energy century, and it's going to be a new technology century. And as the cost of technology, it always comes down. The cost of scarce resources, as their demand goes up, always goes up. So at some point, you hit a tipping point where technology-based energy, solar, wind, storage, who knows what, fusion, comes hydrogen-powered vehicles. Those become the new reality. And if we have missed out on the technological development of that new reality, because we've been trying to cling to the buggy whip of oil and coal, and China instead, or India instead, or the European Union instead becomes the economic center of those technologies, you can bet that the likelihood of the next century being an American century has been dramatically reduced. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese, I think, have a strategic point of view when they're pursuing these technologies, when they're robbing our companies of their intellectual property, when they're investing by the, I think it's $500 billion they're putting into clean energy in the next 3 years, when they're moving forward with new nuclear technologies. In all of those things, I see a strategic purpose, which is to own the clean energy future and make us their customers.
A lot of people look at this as a terrible problem, and it's insoluble, and we're all going to suffer, and there's nothing we can do about it. But that's so antithetical to the American history of looking at problems as opportunities for the future. And if we don't do what we've done in the past, seize these opportunities, which will not only solve the climate problems for the future, but be a tremendous engine for a whole new development of our economy, we're making a very serious mistake. It's like the forces of the status quo defending themselves so intensely that people aren't thinking about what else we can do and what opportunities are now before us. But I just want to ask the three of you. Senator Kerry recently made a statement about climate change, and he was jumped on by a number of important senators, including the Republican Senate leader. Senator Kerry talked about the risks, and he faced derogatory comments from his critics. What did you think about Senator Kerry's comments about the risk of climate change? Was he justified in the comment he made?
Well, I certainly think he's identified the challenges that we faced. I'm working in the Mekong. He has spoken about the Mekong. He had a history there. And to see what is happening now with development, with climate change, what's going to happen to that massive system that affects 4 countries that we've spent a lot of time with, it is dependent on climate change. And to not speak it is putting your head in the sand. And so I think we need voices that say there is a problem, there is a risk, and we need to do something about it.
How can you deny that there isn't a risk? When you look at, for instance, Mali and the Tuaregs who moved to the north because the drought caused all their crops to dry up. What caused the drought? or the Arab Spring, and this is a bit of a stretch, but the forest fires that occurred in Russia and Eastern Europe in 2010 decimated the wheat crop, and the wheat prices just went through the roof, which created some economic instability in the Middle East, which drew protests. You can see where this is going, but you can walk your way all the way around the world with examples for this, all the way around, from the North Pole to the Middle East to Asia. It's a huge risk, and some would say, oh, it's just too much, we can't do anything about it. But we can do a lot of things about it. There's been some minor successes. CAFE standards. Who would think we can get cars that can go 55 miles per gallon, 54 miles, and the auto industry supported it. We can do better. We can get alternative energies. I think we're working on those things. When you've got South Korea, China, India, and France all investing more in fusion energy than we are, you'd think there's something wrong with this equation here, that should we not be on the forefront of the investment of these alternative energies. So I think Secretary Kerry's comments were spot on.
I assume you agree.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's his duty to shine a spotlight on this issue. It's one of the most pressing issues that the State Department has. And Secretary Kerry would be remiss if he didn't continue to shine a light on this issue, despite what critics may say, despite what congressional representatives duly representing the narrow interests of their constituents might have to say about the issue. We have to continue to keep shining a light on it and chart a path forward. And he's withering the criticism well, right? And he's been a pretty steadfast voice in this fight for several years. I sat on him, sat in a panel with him several years ago in the Senate. He was a staunch voice then. He's a staunch voice now as a secretary, and I hope that he continues to be such in this position. He's doing a great service for our nation.
Well, Senator and I, in a letter to Senator McConnell, after he made the criticism of Secretary Kerry that we wanted to provide a briefing for him. I'm sorry we didn't think to invite him here today.
I'm sure he would have come.
What you've had to say is something that I think would be very enlightening for him and help him readjust his thinking about the risks for the planet and maybe minimizing the risk for his reelection, because Kentucky is filled with coal, but the future of this country depends on thinking beyond that and facing the climate risks as a genuine concern.
I can't help but think that the senator also lives on a waterway that is dependent on what could happen with climate change. We move a great deal of agricultural and fossil fuel products on those waterways. And so it's also tightly knit. Mm-hmm. And it will bite you one way or another.
Very good point. Well, you've been terrific.
Well, sure. Should we wrap up? I want to thank our witnesses. I think this has been a powerful and very important hearing, and it provides a lot of good material for Chairman Waxman and myself as we continue to press this issue in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, respectively. And I think if there was to be a single closing word, it would be to go back to what General Cheney said about Marine Sergeant Stryker. Life is tough, but it's tougher if you're stupid. And it's time that Congress stopped being stupid about climate change.
That's the final
That's it.
word.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.